let this let this program enrich all of the people who are hearing it, and not only that, and there is a scope of recording has already been started, and definitely I know that with the help of this, after the end of this program, it will reach to many of the scholars. So thank you very much from my end. Let me wish this program a very great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, and thank you, Registrar, sir, Dr. Saurabh Datta, and for your presence. And now I would like to request our Dean, Professor Jayanto Kumar Saha. Perhaps Professor Saha could not join us today for some busy meeting, so he has sent his best wishes to our program. So without further delay, I would like to request Dr. Annette Balaam to present her talk. Dr. Balaam, the entire virtual platform is all yours now.
I can't thank you enough, all of you, for your kindnesses. It's an incredible event that you've organised here. And, you know, it's actually an honour and a privilege for me to be here as well. So thank you for all of your kindnesses. It's fabulous. I do have a slideshow, PowerPoint. So if we could go to the first slide, please. Definition of the posthuman has changed. Its meaning over the recent years, evolving in line with the rapid development of technology and its influence on the human and the world. The title posthuman can mean anything from the biologically or technologically enhanced or altered human to a human so completely augmented and altered by digital technology that there is no difference between the human and AI or artificial life. The term has also been linked to a post-Anthropocene age, an age in which the human is no longer seen as the dominant species on Earth. But no matter what definition of the posthuman we use, that posthuman still needs a world to exist in. Just as any human, animal, life form, or object has an actual world and context that they are situated in, a world with fixed and precise spaces, places, and times. So the posthuman needs a world to inhabit. And it is this world that this paper explores, asking the question of how do we remain human in the digital world? Exploring the idea whether we need a new definition of the human that enables us to exist within the new world created by the new digital technology. A technology that is based on the world of potentiality and probability that is the world of quantum technology. This paper explores how Samuel Beckett prefigures our experience in the digital world, exploring Beckett's unique world and ontological locus, a locus for being human, where Beckett oscillates our sense of being in between the actual and the virtual. A world that speaks of Beckett's no man's land or existential void and space that is neither here nor here nor here. This is a world of potentiality rather than actuality, where we are constantly in the process of leaving that world just as we arrive. This is a world that is continuously emerging, never stabilizing, and in a state of continuous incompletion, a world in between the actual and the virtual realm, a hybrid world, a world in a locus of process. As in Beckett's world, so in the digital world, where our sense of being oscillates in between the actual and the virtual. Oscillating in between the actual and virtual world, I communicate with a multitude of people, places, and times simultaneously and equally with the only certain materiality of a singular I body. I simultaneously function on Facebook, Twitter, I Zoom, Skype, email, game, Google, text, and talk. And yet, I only have one material body. Oscillating in between the singular and the multiple, identities, times, places, and spaces, relational contexts and worlds, any fixed a priori conditions of space, time, and causality, cause and effect, that I use to place an I here have become uncertain and unclear. Oscillating in between the actual and the virtual world, the only certainty is uncertainty. This space and world in between the actual and the virtual is a possible locus for being human that draws on the philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Pierre Levy, Catherine Hayes, Donna J. Haraway, Giles Deleuze, and Felix Guattari. A space and world in between the actual and virtual realms that the posthuman of these contemporary philosophers can inhabit. A posthuman which focuses not on individual humans and identities, but on the processes, multiplicities, and potentiality of existence that now identifies humanity. This is Beckett's world, that exists in the same state of process, multiplicity, and potentiality for the posthuman of contemporary philosophy to inhabit. A world in a state of continuous incompletion, in a locus of process. A world that sits somewhere in between the real and the unreal, the actual and the virtual, somewhere in between the object and the subject. A new world, Beckett called a no man's land, an existential void in between the actual and the virtual realm. And unlike the actual world, an existential void contains nothing, no fixed, precise, or determined a priori conditions of space, time, and causality. Next slide, please. Most of Beckett's work places his characters in this black existential void, a void where all distinctions, borders, and differences in between the subject and the objective world, the actual and the virtual, the real and the imaginary, presence and absence, organic and technology have disappeared. Can this ambiguous, indeterminate and fluid world, in between the extremes of being nothingness, speak of a new ontological locus, a locus for being human, for the digital human? I consider a non-catastrophic point of view for the future coexistence of the human and machine. When using any digital technology, whether a computer, TV, smartphone, or any digital device, we enter into a new enclosed space or digital world with different cultural codes, spatial organization, or temporal frames, new a priori conditions of space, time, or causality. A new world that is as real in human experience as the actual physical world. In the actual world, we exist in a physical, concrete, material world with fixed, precise, and defined times, spaces, places, identities, and relational and cultural contexts. We exist in a stable reality. But when using any digital technology, our sense of being oscillates in between the actual and the virtual world, where our sense of having any fixed, precise, or stable times, spaces, places, or identity disappears. This is Beckett's world. How did Beckett create his existential void, or no man's land? A locus of process for the contemporary human to exist in. Next slide, please. What does it look like, feel like, for our sense of being to oscillate in between the actual and the virtual realm? What does it feel like to exist in a hybrid, digital, or quantum world? Going back to Beckett's work and the processes he used to create and construct his worlds, can reveal how he created his no man's land and a possible locus for the contemporary posthuman to exist in. As a writer and a director, Beckett spent his whole life translating and adapting all of his work. In the processes of translating and adapting his work from language to language, from place to place, from theatre to theatre, Beckett soon recognised the constraints and difficulties involved. In recognising the difficulties of the translation and adaptation process, basically the changing conditions of creation, Beckett integrates an interpretive strategy into the text, a strategy that results in a text that oscillates the reader or the audience in between a precise, fixed and defined text and world and an ambiguous, fluid and undefined text and realm. In between the actual and the virtual text and world, Beckett produces a work in a state of continuous incompletion, or the Joycean work in progress, and a work that exists in Beckett's no man's land and a locus of process. Looking at how Beckett translated and adapted his work and the deeply collaborative relationships involved in the actual creation of his work opens up the conversations surrounding Beckett's global reputation for a precise and meticulously finished text, aesthetic rigour, high level of authorial involvement, control and inflexibility in the reproduction of his work, which opens up the conversation surrounding the issues of censorship from Beckett and Beckett's literary estate since his death in 1989, and broadens out the possibilities in how we reproduce his work now and in the future. Going back to the archives and Beckett's creative processes allows us to explore how Beckett creates a locus in between the actual and the virtual worlds, a hybrid world for the posthuman to exist in. Next slide. There is no doubt that Beckett did have a strict policy restricting and controlling the adaptation and reproduction of his work, as these famous quotes show. But he also gave a huge amount of permission for the adaptation of his work throughout his life. This apparent contradiction in Beckett's attitude and working practices concerning the adaptation of his work reflects a fundamental aesthetic paradox that is built into the structure of his work. And by exploring this aesthetic paradox, we can create a counter-narrative to the popular stories around Beckett's and his estate's strict control over the reproduction of Beckett's work. This aesthetic paradox embedded in Beckett's work emerges from his working practices, mainly from three working practices. First was his habit of abandoning, changing and reusing his cuts and changes from text to text. Secondly, his ability to form intensely collaborative working relationships with many people in the creative genesis of his work. And thirdly, his ability to write unfinished, imprecise, and indeterminate texts. These three working practices produces a body of work in a state of continuous incompletion, or a work in progress, with an ability to be continuously adapted and consequently difficult to censor. Beckett's work exists in a locus of process, in a continuous state of incompletion, in part born out of the cuts and changes he made during the creative genesis of the text. Next slide. As Mark Nixon notes, Beckett would produce facts du parts, or false starts. Quote, Beckett would start one text, lay it aside to start another, and then return to the original, or amalgamate the two, or abandon both. End quote. Beckett could then reuse these false starts for another text, or if Beckett abandoned the cuts and changes, they became residua, or residue, which Beckett would then in turn reshape and reuse continually, which creates not only transgeneric works, the unfinished works arguably still in the process of creation or continuous in creation. The Joycean work in progress. Now, extending this working practice into the post-publication process, it is now an accepted fact within the discipline of Beckett studies that in his role as director and writer, Beckett made cuts and changes in production that were never reproduced in the printed text, which consequently produces a multitude of possible interpretations or adaptations of one particular text. An adaptational process that again arguably produces a manuscript in a locus of process, in a process of continuous incompletion. Is there one absolute Beckett text to replicate? Many of Beckett's changes only happened after the first publication of the text or staging of the play, which is interpretation and adaptation based on engagement and a form of performativity, an interpretation or adaptation dependent on the constantly changing environment of performance and the context when reading the text. It is only these specific participants or reader in that moment of engagement with that particular text, in that particular space and time, that a particular version of a Beckett text comes into being out of the multitude of possible choices Beckett made available. Consequently, the audience or reader are creating their own adaptation of the Beckett text, dependent on the context within which they exist in that moment of time. But these are texts that don't just depend on the context and contingencies of performance. They also rely on the participant mixing and matching the multitude of cuts and changes Beckett made after the first publication or performance of the text. Beckett's texts depend on the participant or reader deliberately reconfiguring his text on the instant of engagement with a version of the text, as Beckett himself continuously reshaped the text in the process of creation. Beckett produces an art that is autogenic. It develops itself every time it is engaged with. Are Beckett's texts living texts? Next slide. Before his death in 1989, Beckett wrote to the exigencies of the moment, tailoring, contextualizing, changing, adapting, and modifying his art in a process of continuous creation. A process of creation partly founded on a lifetime of Beckett forming deeply collaborative relationships with the directors, actors, producers, designers, technicians, publishers, interpreters, literary and dramatic agents, and institutional bodies such as the BBC, who created his work. Beckett almost always invited other artists into the genesis moment and act of artistic creation with him. Beckett also frequently relinquished responsibility for the creation of his work to those collaborators, which again opens up the conversation concerning the traditional narratives surrounding Beckett's aesthetic rigor and high level of authorial involvement, control, and inflexibility in the reproduction of his work. Next slide, please. Briefly exploring the stage play Waiting for Godot in the decade in between its birth in 1953 to 1962 reveals that Beckett gave the BBC and others permission for the stage play to be adapted, intermediated, and interpreted many times, which contradicts his own opposition to adaptation and transmediation. In 1953, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and Beckett thought that the stage play Waiting for Godot could be adapted into any media. The BBC's Paris representative, Miss Celia Reeves, stated in March 1953 that the stage play might be suitable for the radio on the BBC Third programme. Beckett gave his permission, and in August 1953, copyright permission for a radio version of the stage play was given. But by October 1953, the BBC decided not to create a radio version of the stage play Waiting for Godot. By June 1954, the BBC now considered Godot to be suitable material for the medium of television due to the early success and popularity of the play in Europe. Then in May 1955, the BBC finally abandoned transferring the English version of Godot to sound radio. But in March 1960, the BBC director Donald McWhinney wrote to Beckett to inform him that he was very pleased with his tape recording of Godot and that its first transmission would be on the Radio Third programme on 27th of April. Soon after this, in May 1960, Beckett began negotiations with the BBC to film and broadcast an English television version of the stage play. And by May 1962, a film adaptation of Godot was discussed with Peter O'Toole and Kenneth Griffin as Vladimir and Estragon. Throughout all of his negotiations with the BBC, there is no doubt that Beckett gave his permission for the adaptation and intermediation of the stage play Waiting for Godot many, many times. In his relationship with the BBC, Beckett would both deny and give permission to transfer, adapt, and change his texts in equal measure. An ambiguous aesthetic stance that Beckett firmly maintained throughout his life. The stage play Endgame went through the same process as Waiting for Godot. Beckett wrote to John Morris of the BBC in February 1957, refusing permission for a radio adaptation of Endgame because he thought the stage play, Vindapati, Endgame, would be unsuitable for radio, just as the radio play, All That Fall, was unsuitable for the stage. And yet 2 months later, in April 1957, McWhinney writes to Beckett, informing him of a successful French radio recording and broadcast of Vindapati. Beckett collaborated with a huge amount of people and institutions, which also produces individual creators of Beckett's work. Individual creators who were involved in making fundamental aesthetic choices for Beckett's plays as we now know them. Who created Beckett's plays? Next slide. After the BBC Two broadcast relevant, Beckett requested that the last four-line quote from the poem The Tower in the television play But the Clouds be changed to the whole 15-line final section of the poem. This request to swap the 4 lines of poetry to the 15 lines of poetry had been done in the Stuttgart version in Germany. But Beckett wrote to Tristan Powell of the BBC that because he had not seen or heard this extended version, he was uncertain whether this would be an improvement or not. Equally uncertain as to whether this change was even technically feasible, Beckett left this fundamental creative decision whether to use the 4 or the 15-line quote from the poem to Powell, the director, Donald McWhinney, Powell, the producer, Donald McWhinney, the director, and Ronald Pickup, the actor. Quad is a later play that Beckett wrote in 1980 to 1981 and is another variant of this collaborative creative process. Written and produced by Beckett for the German television company SDR, the second part of Quad Quad 2 was a serendipitous variation added to Quad 1 through the processes of rehearsal at the SDR studios in Stuttgart. Checking the colour print of Quad 1 on the studio monitor to confirm that it would work on black and white television sets at the end of the shoot, the producer Reinhard Müller-Freienfels told Beckett how impressive it looked in black and white. A friend then suggested that they show the colour version first and then the black and white version. After hearing his friend's suggestion, Beckett then requested if they could record a black and white version at a slower speed the next day. The most important change within Quad was created by his collaborators in a co-creational relationship. Beckett's practices of collaborating and adapting his work in the process of creation is a method he used across his whole body of work throughout his lifetime. This is the Beckett who ultimately approved and gave permission for a multitude of recreations, adaptations, and transmediations of his work, as much as he refused permission. A process of reproducing his work that is currently replicated by his literary estate. But the public mainly hear of the transgressions against a Beckett contract in the media. Consequently, these minority examples become the norm and symbolic of a greater issue concerning artistic freedom, and not a representation of the amount of adaptation post-Beckett or what Beckett himself sanctioned. Beckett's compositional and collaborative processes produces a text that exists in a state of continuous recreation, oscillating in between a precise, finished and closed text and a text that is imprecise, unfinished and open to infinite interpretive possibilities. In recognizing the changing conditions of creation, Beckett integrates an interpretive strategy into the text. An interpretive ability that emerges through the act of Beckett constantly oscillating the construction and direction in every text, in between the extremes of exactitude and precision, contrasted with the general and imprecise, the actual and the virtual. Next slide, please. Mouth and Not I is definite in her vehement refusal to relinquish third person, and yet is simultaneously very vague when she is ad-libbing from the text as required. This is an ambiguous text that constantly moves in between a precise, exact, and meticulously finished and fixed work in its construction and instruction, while simultaneously being considered unfinished, undefined, fluid, and a world open to infinite adaptation and interpretive ability. Beckett oscillates every text in between the extremes of exactitude and precision, contrasted with the general and imprecise. Next slide, please. Ghost Trio has a corridor with a very specific width, but no length. The sound is faint and tuned accordingly, but the precise music is precisely choreographed. The furniture is a generic some kind, but is a precise size in a precisely sized room and is shown for a precise amount of time. In But the Clouds, the timing is precise, M1's movement is exact, and yet there are no identities for M, M1 or V, and W's face reduced as far as possible. The set is about 5 meters, and the lighting is gradual as everything bends and flexes to allow contextualization to that particular stage and context, and thus allows adaptation. Breath has timings that are about 5 seconds and a stage covered in miscellaneous rubbish, but the light and sound are strictly synchronized, vaguening the directions even further. Beckett allows the size of quad stage to be determined by anyone's 6 paces, and the director can use all possible combinations of lighting, costume and percussion. These are stage directions that are determined through the act of engagement and recreation of the text in the process of rehearsal. Timing is approximate in quad. The players are as alike as possible in age and build, and the gender is indifferent. These are vague suggestions and not precise instructions, and are written for adaptation. Next slide, please. In the prose, the unnameable has no fixed a priori conditions of space and time, and thus no identity. Enough's character has no gender. Ping is in a limbo of traces and blurs with no signs of meaning, and Worstwood Ho has no named character, and with no verbs, has no causality, cause and effect. With no verbs, there is no action, no indication of time or space. Beckett oscillates our sense of being and understanding in between the exact and imprecise interpretive possibilities. Consequently, the audience or reader are placed into their own creative process to try and complete, fix and stabilize the text, to bring any or a stable world into being. To stabilize and complete the world of the text, the participator is forced into a conscious act of recreation using their own context and imagination. A conscious creative process that draws reflexive attention of the participator to the mechanisms of the medium we are using to create our reality. Now, in exposing the mechanisms or tools that we use to create the reality we are existing in, also exposes the artificiality of the reality we are in. We see and know that we are creating the world within which we are inhabit. We know that the world we inhabit is a construction which breaks the fourth wall and again draws attention to the constructed nature of both the illusionary realm of the stage or narrative and to the concrete actual world. Breaking the fourth wall creates a distance-provoking formalism, the alienation effect, and the meta-theatrical hyper-reflexivity on the processes of creating the reality that we exist in. A compounded process that forces the participator into a conscious act of recreation in order to complete the world of the text. Beckett's theatre creates an interpretive opportunity for every participator to recreate his worlds. Next slide, please. Beckett's texts exist in a continuous state of incompletion, constantly becoming other in a locus of process and movement, somewhere in between being and nothingness. A locus for being human described by Giles Deleuze and adopted from Henry Bergson's key idea of duration or durée, in which mind and consciousness is a flow of experience, and durée is the immediate awareness of this flow, a consciousness of the continuous incompletion of reality, of the flow and continuous process of creation that Beckett would have been aware of from his knowledge of the many philosophers, including Arthur Schopenhauer's understanding of the Upanishads of the Vedas, which describes the flow of mind energy as the creation of the world. In recognizing the flow and changing conditions of creation, Beckett integrates an interpretive strategy into the text, resulting in a text that is both open and closed to interpretive possibilities. Beckett realised that the contingency involved in the processes of translation and adaptation facilitated the production of an ambiguous space in between being and nothingness in his work, a liminal or border zone that he called a no man's land, a locus of process or jure, which is a possible location for the posthuman of the digital reality to inhabit. Next slide, please. This locus of process is a region also represented in one of Beckett's favourite works of literature, Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. Dante introduced the idea of an anti-hell in Inferno 3, a region that lies on the very threshold of hell for those whose existence consists of waiting for Godot, to enter hell forever, a no man's land, occupied by those who had lived a life compromising and suspending any decisions and actions on the important issues of life. But this inert existential void, a no man's land that contains nothing, is also one in which Beckett distances the audience or reader from the text, creating the reflexivity and consciousness on the processes we use to recreate the world that we exist in, to complete Beckett's texts. We see and know that we are creating the world within which we inhabit. Consequently, Beckett creates the opportunity for an audience or reader to make a conscious decision and take the action to participate in recreating the world that they exist in. Beckett was not looking for slavish adherence to the text because of the fundamentally undefined, open and fluid nature of the text, which ultimately results in a performance in a text that can both adhere to the written word in the same moment as contextualizing to that particular space and time. This is an interpretive strategy that creates a text that lives in the process and flow of continuous incompletion, only coming into being in the moment of recreation. Beckett's work is so intrinsically entwined in the process and moment of creative genesis that any recreation of the text is the text. Beckett's texts were written with an ability to be adapted to fit any space or time, making the Beckett text a living text available to infinite and indefinite innovation and reinterpretation. Fundamentally, it's irrelevant whether any production complies to or resists Beckett's or the estate's censorship, as both the traditional and experimental production will ultimately subject and force the audience or reader into the same participatory act of having to recreate Beckett's world. Beckett's work demands active participators involved in the recreation of his worlds, rather than passive spectators immersed in the world with which they are presented. Beckett forces a conscious contemplation of the individual's responsibility for the world that they exist in. This apparent control over the participators of his work suggests an aesthetic dictatorship. But ultimately, this is a benign aesthetic dictatorship, embedding as it does the concept of personal choice between taking responsibility for recreating your world or allowing others to perform that task for you. Who creates the world that we inhabit? Beckett's world oscillates our sense of being in between the actual and the virtual, in between being and nothingness, and into the very act of creation itself. We create the world that we inhabit. Within the digital world, the human exists in the same ontological locus and condition, oscillating in between the actual and the virtual world, in between the multiple and singular I-body. But currently, a conscious knowledge that we exist somewhere in between being and nothingness, every time we interact with any digital technology, is limited. with a clear acknowledgement that the digital human exists in an existential void where there are no fixed spaces, places, times, or identities, be all that's needed to ameliorate a sense of existential angst that the digital human swims in. Is it that simple? A clear acknowledgement of our sense of being continuously oscillating in between the actual and the virtual realm offers the same opportunity that Beckett offers, an ability to make a conscious choice whether you recreate the world that you exist in, or whether you allow others to recreate that world for you. This is a fundamental choice, which is also based on the same actions of the algorithms that run every digital device ever made or will be made. Within the digital world, we oscillate in between the actual and the virtual world, existing in a void and realm based on potentiality, possibility, and probability, a world created by the algorithms that run any digital device. The algorithms used for artificial intelligence, AI, or machine learning are based on a popular misconception about computer algorithms, which is relevant when thinking about fabricating a superintelligence that can mimic and supersede human intelligence. When thinking about how we use these algorithms purely in terms of questioning their use in the development of fully autonomous weapons, cars, surgical procedures, or financial and informational systems. In the 1950s, at the dawn of the computer age, a Bell's Lab engineer, Claude Shannon, published a paper in the Philosophical Magazine in 1950 entitled Programming a Computer for Playing Chess, that dealt with mechanical thinking. Shannon developed two types of programming for an AI of chess, the algorithms of which are still the basis for all computer programs and machine learning. Type A relies on brute computing power, quote, which calculates the relative value of all possible moves as far ahead as in the game as the speed of the computer allowed, end quote. A comparative process that is effectively a numbers game of mass selection based on probability. Type A compares and contrasts and decides that this is the answer that has the highest probability of being correct. Type B tried to use intelligence rather than raw power to give the computer an understanding of the game, whereby it focuses, quote, on a small number of attractive moves while ignoring the rest, end quote. This is an AI that would demonstrate selective intuition. The computer in the 1950s was not fast enough for type A of mass selection, as there are, quote, over 300 billion possible ways to play just the first 4 moves in a game of chess. And even if 95% of these variations are terrible, a type A program would still have to check them all, end quote. Therefore, in the 1950s, type B of intelligent intuitive selection over mass selection was the only feasibility. But in the 1950s, the computer could not think as the human in terms of insight and intuition. So type A, which is based on the brute force of mass selection, was the only option. With type A, the programmer, quote, feeds the computer many examples of a phenomenon, and from those examples the machine deciphers relationships among variables, a statistical method for discovering correlations in past events that then can be used to make predictions about future events. End quote. The machine makes decisions and judgments based on the highest possible odds of being accurate, effectively gambling. There are no 100% correct answers, only probabilities that the answer will be correct. Also, no human programmer can ever enter all of the examples of one instance of human phenomena or behavior from every human being on Earth since the 1950s. No matter how much information all the humans on Earth continually feeds into the machine, the answer the computer produces will only ever be based on the highest probability of being correct. All contemporary computer algorithms are based on type A of blind mass calculation, processing speed, and efficient search algorithms. Type A finds the answer to a question using the highest possible odds of being accurate. Gambling. All contemporary computer algorithms are based on the probability that the answer is correct, and are the algorithms that are used in all machine learning and AI. Type B, algorithms that try to replicate human intuition and insight, are obsolete. Another reason for the choice to use Type A algorithms was the scientific and philosophical thinking on the way the human brain works, and aligning this with how the thinking machines would work. In the 1950s, it was assumed, quote, that the brain must work something like a digital computer, using its billions of networked neurons to calculate thought and perceptions, end quote, which replicates the Type A model that uses blind mass calculation, processing speed, and efficient search algorithms. It was assumed that human thoughts were made in the neurons, or junction boxes of the system, that transmitted by jumping over the gap from neuron to neuron. Brains of computers were thought to hold the answers in the neurons, not in the thought process itself. Recently, it's been discovered that cognition happens in the gap in between the neurons. Thought happens in the processes of transmission. Thought does not happen in the neuron itself. Cognition happens in the process of jumping from neuron to neuron. Thought happens in a locus of process in between the neurons, in between the actual and the virtual realms. Human cognition is a continuous process of transmission. It is only in the continuous transfer of information in between the neurons that life happens. Life exists in a locus of process in a state of continuous incompletion. Beckett's world. Consciousness is a series of problem-solving exercises with brief moments of solutions and answers that are correct for a certain degree of right and for a certain amount of time, in varying degrees of cohesion along a continuum. Reality comes into and out of being in various degrees of cohesion along a continuum. There is no such thing as a fixed reality. The only reality that exists is based on potentialities, probabilities, and possibilities, in which the only certainty is uncertainty. Next slide, please. As the first AI-created pictures demonstrate, the reality of the image created is based on the highest possible odds of being correct. And probability, by definition, cannot be 100% correct. This is a locus of process, a hybrid world in between the actual and virtual realm, a world that is neither here, nor here, nor here. Beckett's world, where there is the only certainty is uncertainty. And when nothing is certain, anything is possible. Next slide, please. I can, therefore I am. Life as a transspatial emergence, neither here, nor here, nor here. Next slide. Time passes. That is all. Make sense who may. I switch off. From Beckett's What Where. Next slide. Thank you. And thank you for operating the slideshow.
Thank you, Dr. Annette Balaam. It's a wonderful lecture and really enriching. And what I have found is that it's a curious mix of Beckett's own philosophy and its association with the philosophy of Deleuze and also the quantum mechanics of Karen Barrett and also the philosophy of digital culture. So it's a wonderful, wonderful lecture, and it's a very timely intervention to Beckett's over, and also, original take on Beckett, I must say. Okay, now I would request Balaam to take over this platform and moderate the question and answer session.
Thank you, sir. So, I would request our dear participants, so if you have any question, you can definitely ask. Or you can also write in the chat box.
Yeah.
And you can all unmute right now.
Good evening. Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah. So this is Bilan Mondal, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Narajul Raj College, and a PhD scholar, Bankura University. Thank you for your lecture, ma'am. Actually, I was listening to your lecture, being spellbound. Actually, your employment of the theory of Dewey by Henry Wadsworth and Dante's Divine Comedy were actually just awesome. And I have a question to you, ma'am. I have the question from the last line of Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. In both the acts, Beckett said, actually, there is a speech that let us go, but they don't move. So can it be said that this is an yearning for the from a corporal world to a corporeal world in case of post-human migration? This is my question.
I think so, because what's happening is that it's almost, if you go back to that Dante quote, it just reminded me so much of they're just suspended. They're suspended. Where are they? I mean, it's almost Dante's purgatory, isn't it? You know, where they're just held in one position. Where is time? Where is space? Where is cause and effect? Things just happen to them. You know, sometimes it's the same when you're online. You know, people just appear out of nowhere. Emails just appear out of nowhere. You haven't caused them to happen. They just appear. So there's no cause and effect that you have created. And it's the same with Waiting for Godot, I think, is that are they yearning and stretching and looking for some kind of fixity, for looking for some kind of determined reality, a reality that is going to allow them to move forward, because they don't have any time there. Time doesn't move for them. It's almost like they're hovering in this no man's land, and they can't go backwards, they can't go forwards. They point to the audience, so you've got that. The audience is suddenly made aware you live in a constructed reality. You know, in the audience, they point to the audience, and one Vladimir goes off stage for a wee. That is telling the audience, this is a stage show. This is not real. This is not reality. I'm not going to allow you to immerse yourself and disappear into this other world. The audience are forced constantly and are constantly reminded that this is not real. So what that's doing is that's also making them aware of the reality around themselves when they're sat in the audience. So if you make the audience aware that they're in a constructed world, then that gives them the choice and the opportunity to construct that world for themselves. So you're constantly making, Beckett's constantly making the audience aware that this is not a real world, but I'm giving you the choice to recreate that world if you want to move you out of that no man's land, that existential void, to move you beyond that. I hope that answers your question. You.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
I have a comment. Annette, this is Michael Coffey from New York. A wonderful paper, and I would guess that Beckett would have been absolutely fascinated by your discussion of locating thought somewhere within the neuronal net inside the brain. My question, though, is, somewhat far afield, but if Beckett were in the 21st century, what kind of work do you think he would be doing? Now that you've cited it so convincingly that many of the things that interested him and that he couldn't sort of get away from were in these indeterminate spaces where, probabilities and the human itself was sort of fleeting and somewhere in between spaces.
I think it's a fabulous question. I think he would be certainly definitely interested in quantum and this idea that everything just hovers in a space of probability. Nothing exists until we decide it exists. Nothing exists until it's observed. The whole quantum idea. And nothing exists until we decide it does. And so there are stage productions out there that kind of approach this whole idea of there being no fixed story, no beginning, no end, no middle, no identity, no fixed time or space or place. All you get is, I saw a production of a play in the university in Bristol where there was a character, but he became, he was a character of a sort of delivery man, delivering stuff, from Amazon delivery man perhaps. And yet at the same time, what was done with the script, because the script was so fractured and dysfunctional, it didn't have any linear narrative. It didn't have a beginning, middle and end. It just shot off into Greek myth. It shot off into something like 2010, Arthur C. Clarke's 2010, drifted off into the future. It drifted off into the past. It then performed vaguely ritualized movements and dance. Its music was, 1 minute it was again ancient, the next minute it was extremely immersive. And by immersive, there is no definition of immersion. What is immersion? Is immersion being forced or being consumed by the machine? The machine, the world that you're entering when you enter a digital world, is that coming towards you, overloading your senses and forcing you to go into that world, so you don't create the world that you exist in when you are in immersion, when you're in an immersive world within any digital technology. Or, as in Beckett's world, you are made aware that you are being immersed, but because you're being immersed, and you're made aware of that, you still have the choice to create the world that you live in the digital space. So there are productions out there that are beginning to make scripts and performances that have no linear narrative. They have no beginning, middle, end. They go all over the place. The action goes all over the place. Actually, interestingly enough, the setting of the play, again, the staging of it was done in the dark. It was done in the void. So anything that was put on that stage, in the center of the stage, was fundamentally in a void, an existential void. So, and then it used bits and pieces of technology, but not obviously. But it was so fractured and unfixed that I think this is the sort of thing that Beckett would be doing. He would have developed, certainly, I think his scripts are so unfixed. They're oscillating between these two, the fixed, the precise, and the imprecise. I think he would have taken that further, and it would have been more extreme.
Yes.
And perhaps, his passion for maths and precision, but also for vagueness and stuff. I think he would have developed that further, and he's certainly been interested in quantum. Absolutely. Thank you.
It sounds like maybe he would have been creating video games where we each claim an avatar, and we wander through these realities that we create, these virtual realities that we create.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for being here. Pleasure to see you.
My pleasure.
There is a question in the chat box. Dr. Abdul Rashid is asking, does Beckett has a sense of reference? So, I don't know.
It does have a sense of reference, a sense of context, perhaps, because he actually, he was in terms of, he did use an extraordinary, he was very interested in philosophy, he was very interested in the arts, he was very interested in science, he was interested in an incredible amount of disciplines. So he constantly does reference those in his work. You can see that once you start analysing his work. You can bring out arts, famous artists, you can bring out famous philosophies in his work. But also, as to whether it context, you see, again, he was post Second World War, and in a war, all our norms, our habits, our conventions, everything that is our daily life is destroyed. So nothing is left. In a war, all of our habits and norms are broken because they can't survive. And so what happens, I think, certainly after the Second World War, when Beckett was starting to write, was that the context in which he was writing was fundamentally destroyed. The world that you knew that was pre-war, that you have a day-to-day job, you brush your teeth, you cook your meals, you're safe to walk the roads. All of that is destroyed. The world, the normal world and the normal habits and conventions that we use to construct our daily life are broken. The 9-to-5 job is gone. After the war, everything's destroyed. People have to recreate new habits, new norms, new conventions, new societies. They're fundamentally rebuilding the worlds that they live in. And perhaps, that sort of sense of context and sense of referencing that existential void and the sense of actually being forced to recreate the world that you exist in is part of the roots of his writing. Second World War, they were in an existential void, an existential angst. There was nothing that they recognized from their previous lives. There was no routines, habits, norms that people could hang on to restructure and rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally, to rebuild a life, an identity, a time and space. And so they were in this existential void, and perhaps that's where Beckett kind of got this idea, because he was part of that reconstruction of a stable, identifiable world. I hope that answers your question.
There is a long question in the chat box by Shubhaj Banerjee. You can, I think you can read that.
Yeah, demonstrates. I don't know a huge amount of Sartre, but again, it's the same period, the 1950s, when the world was reconstructed vis-a-vis essence as something that follows. Ah, yes. Well, this is it. Does the object come first or second? You know, essence, or the other way, and therefore the essence either does not exist as a predetermined singular reality, or is being made perpetually and therefore fluid and constantly mutating, and generally therefore draws its vitality from Sartre. Well, Sartre was actually around at the time that Beckett was in Paris, Second World War. When he did begin writing, Sartre was around. And I think, again, this is our whole idea that there was an atmosphere of recreating a world, how do we recreate our world? These philosophies all talk about, what is the world? What is reality? How do we recreate it? And what is the human's place in that world? For me, right now, the posthuman of current philosophy talks about a metaphysical multiplicity, where our sense of being in a fixed space, place and time and causality doesn't exist. We're multiple, which then, if we have multiple identities, spaces, places and times on a constant basis, does that mean that we don't have any borders of the body? Now, this goes into, again, another different 1950s philosopher that, again, was around at the same university as Sartre, and around that whole area is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He, unfortunately, died quite young, but his last work, the Nature Notes, talk about the flesh. And he was just touching on the idea, as the Ponty quote there is no space, no here, there, or everywhere. But what does that mean in terms of the flesh? He was talking about how the flesh disappears. There are no borders to the body. The body, the individual, doesn't exist. We, as a multiplicity, co-create the world, just as Beckett collaborated with everyone and everything, co-creating his world. It's this kind of idea that the flesh becomes transparent. We have no borders of the body. The body just becomes this multiplicity, and we exist in a space that has no borders. It can carry on in infinite. There is no time, there's no space, there's no context, there's no fixed identity. Everything just is moving. It just flows. So that means that we become an ontological multiplicity. We have multiple spaces and time. We have no borders of the body. We co-create the worlds that we exist in. But it's knowledge of having that choice, certainly within the digital world, that allows us to make that choice. If we don't know, we exist in an existential void when we're online, which, the space in between you and me right now is an existential void. We don't know that we have to create that reality, that we have to say, right, I am here, I am this person, this is this time. then why would we create it? We wouldn't. The machine would create it for us. So in the 1950s, you have all these incredible philosophers that rose up, certainly in France, which might have something to do with this post-World War context of an existential void. These people had to recreate the world from rubble. New habits, new conventions, new laws, new processes to recreate a world that's been destroyed. And perhaps this is where this kind of philosophy from the 50s comes from, and why it has some kind of connection with us now, because in a digital world, we have to create the reality that we exist in, unless you want the machine to do it for you, unless you want the social media platform that you're existing on to do it for you. You have to determine whether you do that or not. A little bit of a roundabout way of answering that question. I hope it does, but I certainly think that period, if you look at all the philosophers in that period, they are all in that same void, and they're all recreating the world in their different ways, but it's that world still exists in that essential void. Thank you.
Okay.
Brilliant
Thanks,
question.
Annette, and
question.
thanks to our participants for asking great questions. And I'm afraid that we can take any further question because we have very little time in our hand right now. So now I invite Professor Bapin Molli to give the vote of thanks. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Balaram sir. Thank you, Shukhendu sir. I think I am audible, right? Is it okay?
Yes, you are completely audible.
Okay. As introduced by Professor Balaram Balo, this is Bapin Mollik, and I am associated with the Department of English, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College, Beta Noida, as well as I am a PhD scholar of the Department of English, Bankura University. And on behalf of the Center for Research in Posthumanities, it is my privilege to propose vote of thanks in this virtual talk on Beckett and posthumanism. And first of all, I would like to thank Annette Balaam, lecturer, University of the West of England, for this interesting talk, and I am sure that this thought-provoking talk on Samuel Beckett in the age of hybrid reality and posthuman will play a very crucial role in revisiting the works of Beckett from multiple perspectives. I would like to thank our patron, Professor Gautam Buddha Shurao sir, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Bankura University, and our honorable guests, Dr. Saurabh Datta, Registrar, Bankura University, and Professor Jayanta Kumar Saha, Dean, Bankura University, for their constant support and guidance. I'd like to thank the entire team of the Center for Research in Posthumanities for their constant effort and innovative thinking, and which have played a very crucial role for this type of talk. And at the same time, I'd like to extend my thanks to the person who is the mastermind of this whole thing, Professor Shukhendu Dash, whose constant effort and experimental thinking, I must say, experimental thinking plays a very crucial role for this type of program. And he has inspired us to explore all these things from different angles. Thank you, sir. And we are always thankful to our audience, whose presence is very important. Because without audience, this type of lecture is impossible. It is invalid, is irrelevant. So I'd like to thank all the audience who are present with us, and they are constantly with us. And last but not the least, I'd like to thank Zoom and other technical platform like Google Meet, because we have conducted lectures in Google Meet also in our previous talk. So I'd like to thank both Zoom and Google Meet for giving us the opportunity to organize the lecture in virtual mode. So thank you all. Good night, everyone, and I hope we will get you again, madam, and of course the audience in our upcoming lectures. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Balaam, I would just like to mention one thing. that you always have a standing invitation to visit our center. So if you ever come to India, please don't forget to drop an email, and we will be happy to host you in person and in many different institutions in this state or in this country. So I have a question, but I don't want to give you much trouble. We may discuss them over email. So thank you for this enriching lecture.
Yes, sir. Actually, I also have a question, but we'll discuss in email. Right?
So together we will send email.
Yes, definitely.
It's been an absolute pleasure and an honour to be here. You have been so kind. I can't honestly. It's been a wonderful experience. It really has. Thank you so much. You know, I can't thank you enough. It's been just such an enjoyable experience. Thank you very much.
Your talk is the subject of a big seminar. I was just thinking the range of thinking, the range of ideas that you are producing within this very short span of time.
No, ma'am's actually
the deliberations.
Actually, ma'am's voice is so nice. So it was like I was thinking that I can hear ma'am hour and hour and hour.
Thank you. It's so very kind of you. I really have had a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much just for the opportunity to share these ideas, because we must always question what we're doing online. We must always question how technology affects us. You know, and technology is nothing to be afraid of. All it is a tool. All it is an expression of human capability.
Yeah.
You know, from the first flint in the Stone Age, that's just a tool, just as this computer, just as AI, they're just tools that express the capability of humanity. So they're just mirroring the human evolution. AI is just mirroring how the human is evolving. Interestingly, going further, AI just mirrors how the human functions. The computer programs from the 50s that now run everything that we use just mirror how the human functions. But again, that's changing. It always changes. Everything changes all the time. So there's no fixed answer to any of this. But the more we explore it and the more we talk about it with the more people, the more we can open up this world to investigate it, to see what it means, to see how it changes humanity. So you know, this is a really important thing that you've done. You know, hugely important. Never underestimate, I think, the importance of these sorts of conferences and these sorts of lecture series. They'll make the difference in the future to how we exist as humans, to what humanity is. So yeah, I honestly, I can't thank you enough. It's just been an absolute joy and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
We also thank you.
Thanks. Hopefully I'll come and see you in India. I'll see you at the next ones, though. I should be visiting all the others, the other conferences, the other lecture series that you're doing. I shall be visiting them as well. They'll be good. They'll be good. Thank you. See you again. I'll see you soon at the next one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.